Let's get this going by saying good afternoon to our North American friends and good evening to those people who are joining us from Europe and maybe from people in other places halfway around the world. Welcome to the second installment of the Jacob D. Maendel Lectures. My name is Jesse Hofer, and I am one of the organizers of these lectures. I'm joining you from my home community of Silver Winds, where I serve as a middle and high school teacher. I've got about 4 people joining me here and several others remotely. And I'm seeing there's about 71 participants, or at least connections. So we've probably got close to 100 people at least joining us today. Welcome to you all. Before we begin today's lecture, I want to say a few words about the history and the vision of this lecture series, this very young lecture series. Over the last 3 years, Hutterites in Manitoba have been commemorating the centennial of permanent Hutterite settlement in the province of Manitoba. The Jacob D. Maendel Lecture Series was conceived and planned by an ad hoc task force that was responsible for planning events, like publications and other events around the centennial. The inaugural, or the very first lectures, were delivered last year by Ian Kleinsather and focused on the past 100 years of Hutterite history, with an emphasis on the experience of Hutterites in Manitoba, the Schmiedeloid in Manitoba. The lectures were published by the HB Book Center and look like this. This is available through Amazon or through the HB Book Center and is well worth getting. It's about a 100-page publication. The purpose of the lecture is to bring the academic fields of history, theology, literature, and others into the service of the church. Quite an ambitious task. In other words, the scholarship presented in these lectures is to be of a high caliber, but is not merely an academic exercise for its own sake. There's a bigger purpose here. Rather, the scholarship should help the church test its beliefs and practices and reform them as needed. These lectures attempt to cultivate something of Jacob D. Maendel's vision for the church. And as we understand this vision, it includes a deep appreciation for Hutterite history and for the broader Christian tradition. It includes an openness to non-Hutterites and new ideas, a reverence for creation, and a boldness in putting convictions into action. You can read a fuller biography of Jacob Maendel on the website, jdmlectures.org. Before I turn it over to Kenny to introduce Dr. Schlachta, von Schlachta, and outline how the format will work for these lectures, I'd like to lead you in a prayer. Let's pray. Sustaining and liberating God, we give thanks for this opportunity to gather in this unusual way to consider how our forebears struggled with what is worth holding on to and what is worth letting go in order to be faithful followers of Jesus. We ask your blessing upon this lecture series, particularly upon Astrid, as she leads us through our story and poses challenging questions about what it might mean for us today in the year of our Lord, 2020. May these lectures cultivate both a deeper appreciation of our tradition, as well as a passionate hunger for renewal, where these traditions have become stale and lifeless and stifling maybe. We pray in the name of Jesus, the Christ, who is making all things new. Amen. Kenny?
Thank you, Jesse. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see so many of you taking part in this. My name is Kenny Wallman, and I'm with the Hutterian Brethren Book Center, the host organization of the lecture series. Before I introduce Astrid, I will want to draw your attention to how the format of this session is going to work. Astrid will speak for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we want to have a period of engagement where we can ask questions and perhaps go back and forth. Now, there are a few ways that you can ask a question. You can ask this via the Zoom chat feature if you are watching with a personal device, and we will do our best to follow along. If things go well, you can also put your hand up via the Zoom feature, and we will initiate an exchange that way. Another way that you can completely anonymously submit a question is to go to the website menti.com, MENTI.com. At this website, you're going to be prompted to enter a code. The code is 8166. Let me repeat that. At menti.com, you enter the code 8166. You'll then be asked, given a prompt, what question do you want to ask Dr. von Schlachta? And once you've typed it in, you can submit it, and we will bring them all together, and one of the moderators will post it to Dr. von Schlachta at the end. So let me share with you a few words about Dr. von Schlachta. And I'm going to try to make some connections, as many as I can, to the Hutterite world so that you get a sense of where she comes from. First of all, presently she is the historian and director at the Mennonitische Forschungsstelle at the Weierhof in Germany. This is a position that was formerly held by somebody that many Hutterites know, namely Gary Waldner. And we're very glad to see that Gary Vetter is here in our Zoom gathering today as well. So Astrid has taken over his position and continues the work and research there. She's also a lecturer at the Universität Ravensburg. And for most of her academic life, she has been researching the Anabaptists with a particular emphasis on the Hutterites. This began with her dissertation, which is available in published form and looks like this. It's a considerably massive volume, Hutterische Konfessionen und Tradition, and it also deals with the tension between Hutterite confessionalism tradition and how to live that out in practice. More recently, she has published this book. Both of these are the same book. One is in German and the other is in English. And similar to this lecture series, it covers the entire scope of Hutterite history up to the current period. So if any of you are intrigued by things that Dr. von Schlachta is going to share with us today, you can look into some of the books that she has written. Her most recent book, Täufer von der Reformation ins 21. Von der Reformation bis ins 21. Jahrhundert. So Anabaptists from the Reformation to the 21st century, is being released this month. A while back when I was communicating with Astrid, she was not responding to emails, and afterwards I learned why. She had sequestered herself for 6 weeks to complete this manuscript. So again, a massive undertaking on her part. She's currently the president of the Mennonitische Geschichtsverein and an organizer of the 500 Jahre Täuferbewegung 2025 Society that is preparing to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Anabaptist movement in 2025. Dr. von Schlachta has been to Manitoba at least 5 times to visit various communities and to make presentations. We were very disappointed that she couldn't return to Manitoba to give this series in person, but nevertheless, we are grateful to God that we can gather in this way and for the technology that exists that enables us to do so. So please welcome in your heart with rousing applause very warmly, Dr. Astrid von Schlachta. Astrid?
Yo, let me just change a bit here. Okay, yo, thank you both of you for this friendly welcoming, and it's quite awkward to be here at the Weierhof and to speak to all of you in Manitoba, in Canada. I don't know where else you are. I'm very honored to be here to present the second Maendel lecture in Corona times. Quite awkward because I don't get the reaction from you to my lecture, so I always like to get the response directly. But at least we can get together virtually, and that's the good part about Corona, that we all learned very fast how to use these new technologies. And I mean, I think it's fascinating that I can welcome you all here from Manitoba in our Mennonite Research Center, where I'm in now. So all of you who have been to the Weierhof already know the Forschungsstelle, and that's the place where I'm here now. And I want to start with a statement from a source Ian Kleinsasser used in his lecture of last year. He quoted Hans Decker from Wolf Creek Colony, South Dakota, who said in 1958 about his fellow Hutterite believers, and he especially meant the schools, but I think the sentence is very, very good for us today too. Hans Decker said, "The drive to earn money has taken control to such an extent that spiritual responsibilities are pushed to the side." A statement that has a recurring meaning for the Hutterites in their history, as we will see today. And I will now take you back into the 16th century, into the times of the Reformation, when also the Anabaptist movement started as one branch of the Reformation. And that's always very important for us to say that the Anabaptists and thus the Hutterites, they are a branch of the Reformation. The Reformation is much more than Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli. But initially, many Anabaptists were followers of Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli. Martin Luther in Wittenberg, Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich. They agreed with them that a person is not saved by works, but by grace. That no priest or minister can convey salvation, but only faith in Jesus Christ. And they agreed that each person has to make his own faith decision. That every believer should read the Bible for himself. And the consequence is, for example, that in Switzerland, in Tyrol, so-called Lesekreise or reading circles were established. There, believers gathered to discuss current developments. They read the Bible together, they interpreted the Bible, and they prayed together. That is mature, or that was mature Christendom. And many later Anabaptists were part of these groups. But the Anabaptists also criticized Luther and Zwingli. First of all, in their attitude towards politics. Luther and Zwingli, that was the impression of the Anabaptists, Luther and Zwingli were too much relying on political help to implement their spiritual reforms. The Anabaptists wanted to keep the spiritual community strictly separate from politics and the influence of politics. Second, Luther and Zwingli did not want to change anything in regard to baptism. They stuck with infant baptism. And third, the idea of the church. For the Anabaptists, the congregation was to be an assembly of true believers who consciously professed their faith, were baptized in this faith, and lived a life according to Christian norms. The Anabaptist movement was quite colorful and diverse. And for me, this presentation is also a challenge because I want to share the screen from time to time to show you a few slides, and I hope that works now. Yeah, you can see the map. Can you just give me your, okay, Jesse says, okay, fine, everything works. So this is a map of Europe in the 16th century with the different Anabaptist groups in different colors. On the left side, on the top, you have the North Sea, on the right side, the Baltic Sea, and you have here the main Anabaptist groups that were mainly The Swiss brethren that were in Switzerland, it's the yellow group there, in Switzerland and Southwest Germany. You had the Mennonites, the red ones, in Northwest Germany and the Netherlands. And you had the Hutterites, they are in green, mainly here in Moravia, but also coming from Tyrol. And there are some smaller groups that disappeared in the course of the 16th century. It was mainly the Hutterites, the Swiss brethren, and the Mennonites that remained. And we want to take a look now, a very short look at the beginning of the Hutterites in Tyrol, because Tyrol is somehow, as you all know, the homeland for the Hutterites. In Tyrol, the persecution of the Anabaptists was very harsh. And I always think this image from the 16th century, it shows actually the Switzerland, but the scene could also have taken place in Tyrol, where you see the Anabaptists gathering in the woods, somebody, the preacher, having the Bible and preaching, a woman kneeling in front of the table, maybe waiting to be baptized, we don't know. But this peaceful scene was not peaceful very long, because then the troops from the authorities came and took the Anabaptists to prison. In Tyrol, the persecution was very harsh, harsher than in other parts of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Thus, for the Anabaptists, it was impossible to establish churches in Tyrol. So many Anabaptists migrated from Tyrol to Moravia. There in Moravia, very tolerant landlords provided land for the persecuted Anabaptists. The land in Moravia was depopulated due to the plague in the 15th century. The manorial lords wanted to repopulate the land and sought subjects. So the Anabaptists came in the nick of time. This initial situation was the basis for the formation of the Hutterite Church in Moravia and its very positive development, as we will see. It was above all the merit of Jacob Hutter to have resettled many Tyrolean Anabaptists in Moravia. Jacob Hutter was born in the Puster Valley in South Tyrol today, and in 1536 he died at the stake in Innsbruck in front of the golden roof that might have been visited by those of you who have been to Tyrol, and they also then saw the new plaque that remembers the death of Jacob Hutter, which was put up a few years ago. Jacob Hutter was the main organizer of emigration from Tyrol, and he became the first important Hutterite elder in Moravia. Moravia, the land in the east, became a paradise for the Anabaptists because of the very favorable conditions. And therefore, in the course of the 16th century, many of them moved to Moravia and joined the Hutterites. The number of Hutterite colonies, or as it was said in the 16th century, Haushaben or Bruderhöfe, grew in the course of the 16th century. We have here a map of southern Moravia, and you see all the dots or all the points are Hutterite colonies that were established in southern Moravia in the 16th century. New ones were founded again and again. The Hutterites were growing. We have a few numbers, though it is quite difficult to have numbers for the 16th century. But we know that in 1589 there were 57 Bruderhöfe in southern Moravia, maybe with an average of 400 inhabitants living on each of these Bruderhöfen. We also know that in times of need, when maybe one farm or one colony had to be abandoned, then other Bruderhöfe took in the inhabitants, and then it might be that about 3,000 people were on one colony. Until the year 1600, probably 20,000 to 25,000 Hutterites had settled in southern Moravia. This could have corresponded to 2.5% of the population in South Moravia, but it's not quite sure. Some other sources say that maybe the Hutterites were 10% of the population in South Moravia. The centers of Hutterite life were the colonies in Neumühl and Nikolsburg. And you all might know this picture, this engraving from a book actually written against the Anabaptists and against the Hutterites. It is from 1589, and we can see, or this engraving shows very nicely how Hutterites lived in the 16th century. They had large houses. Several of these houses formed one Bruderhof. The people were sleeping in large rooms, and the windows in the roof, they are for these large rooms where the people were sleeping, separated into married couples, single brothers and single sisters. The children in the 16th century, the children of the Hutterites, they slept in the schools, which actually resembled more modern day boarding schools. The Hutterites had very good schools in the 16th century, where teaching was very advanced. Even non-Hutterites sent their children to these schools. This school system, this boarding school system, ensured, for example, that women could work on the colonies all the time. What this engraving from Erhard, Christoph Erhard, also shows is when you have a look at the windows. We see it is, we say in German, Butzenfenster. I think the English expression is Glasroundel or so. And these windows show that the Hutterites were not poor at that times, because these Butzenfenster were very expensive in the 16th century. So let's have a look at the economy of the Hutterites in the 16th century, because they were mainly occupied with crafts work in that times. There's another very famous engraving from another book that was polemic book against the Hutterites, from Christoph Andreas Fischer, the Taubenkurbel, and actually that's why it is good that we are here in the Forschungsstelle, because a few years ago we were so lucky to get one copy of these books. So that is one of the original of these books where this engraving is from. And it's very, very beautiful, nice little booklet. This engraving from the book shows Taubenkurbel or dovecote. And on the purchase that come out of the dovecote, you can see the signs of the various crafts the Hutterites had on their colonies. You see a tailor, let me see, you the tailor here. I don't know if you see the mouse, but you see the pottery here that the Hutterites made in the 16th century. You see the baker here, and also here you see the rope maker with den Seilen. There was a variety of crafts on the colonies. Some of them you see here, but there are more. There were carpenters, there were settlers, there was the blacksmiths, knife makers. The knives of the Hutterites were very famous in that times. The pottery, the cobblers, the millers, but also the Hutterites had barbers and doctors. In the 16th century, the Hutterites were known beyond the borders of Moravia for their high-quality handicraft products. Even noblemen were among the buyers. And the Hutterite doctors were also very famous. They worked in noble households. One of the Hutterite doctors even worked for the Emperor Rudolf II when he was in Prague, which was not that far from South Moravia. In addition, the Hutterites practiced agriculture, albeit to a much lesser extent than craftsmanship, mainly for their own subsistence. The view on the economy of the Hutterites and on the Haushaben or the colonies in general in the 16th century, or let's say in the second half of the 16th century, that shows that the Anabaptists were no longer the persecuted in Moravia. They were respected, they produced quality goods, and they were regarded as reliable business partners. And now I'm stopping again that sharing, and I think you see the beautiful Forschungsstelle again. Another part is the spiritual life of the Hutterites. From the early times of the Hutterite church on, a committee of elders was formed to make the most important decisions for the congregation. The committee was called in the sources the Fürnehme or Älteste, which means the dignified or elders. This committee of elders is also mentioned by Peter Riedemann in his Rechenschaft. There he writes, "Finally, there are elders who serve in the church wherever and however need requires. They work with the servants of diligently consider the needs of the church community and to promote its well-being. In this way, they help the servants bear the burden so that the whole church does not need to be concerned with every small matter." So a very nice picture here, the elders as servants of the community, thus Riedemann. Who were these elders and who belonged to that circle or that committee of elders? From the second half of the 16th century, we know the circle of elders definitely included the servants of the word. At times, probably also the servant of temporal needs, the Diener der Notdurft or steward, but this is not quite sure from the sources. But what is interesting that we have in the 16th century something what you can say is group 1 and group 2 together, because on the level of the Hutterite church in whole, we had an elder as well as a committee of elders. They were responsible for the leadership of the congregation collectively. So they worked together, the elder and the committee of the elders. They decided on different things, especially the choice of being a servant of the word or a servant of temporal needs. They decided about the replacement of other important offices. They decided about the ordinances, about banishment and readmission, and they chose those regions where the Hutterites started mission work. Besides this circle of elders on the level of the whole congregation, there was also a committee of elders on each colony. If we have a look at how these servants of the word were elected in the 16th century, then we can say they were probably chosen by lot in the beginning. But then in the course of the 16th century, the appointment by the elders seems to have been the case. The preachers, as well as the servants of temporal needs, were first appointed to the vocation for about 2 years, and afterwards they were confirmed in the office. Every Sunday and every Wednesday, the Hutterites gathered for the Lehr. Sunday, according to the ordinances, it is said there in the ordinances, should be honored and celebrated, but one should not make one's personal piety dependent on the observance of a single day. Faith should be lived out throughout the week. Now I have again the task of sharing the screen. Okay, so here you have a slide that shows few of the offices that you could find in the Hutterite church in the 16th century. You had the Ältesten, the Fürnehme, this is the committee of the elders. You had the Diener des Worts, that was the preacher on each colony. You had the Diener der Notdurft or the Haushalter, steward, as you say today. And you had Vorsteher der Handwerke or Fürgestellte. They were the heads of the various crafts. They were overseers of the crafts workshops. And there were offices which provided for the needs of the community. So, for example, the Weinziel, the winemaker, was responsible for the work in the fields and the vineyards. The waiter, the Kellner, was responsible for the storage and the distribution of the wine and for keeping the barrels clean. There was a special position, the Essentrager, who was working in the kitchen and in the dining room. He supplied his fellow believers with food and drink. And also he had to make sure, it is said, that it was not too loud during the meals. On the female side of the Hutterite community, the highest office was the Haushalterin. She is called in the sources the mother of all sisters, and she was the head in the spinning and the cotton room. So you see, the Hutterite community was very well organized and well structured in the 16th century. You might all know the quotations from the Geschichtsbuch, where the organization of the Hutterite church is described. And I give you 3 short quotes from the Geschichtsbuch. It is said, everyone where he was worked for the common good to supply the needs of all and to give help and support wherever it was needed. It was indeed a perfect body whose living, active members served one another. Think of the ingenious work of a clock, where one piece helps another to make it go so that it serves its purpose. Or think of the bees, those useful little insects working together in their hive, some making wax, some honey, some fetching water until their noble work of making sweet honey is done, not only for their own needs, but enough to share with men. That is how it was among the brothers. And then it continues. So there has to be an order in all areas, for the matters of life can be properly maintained and furthered only where order reigns, even more so in the house of God, whose master, builder, and establisher is the Lord himself. Where there is no order, there is disorder. There God does not dwell, and the house soon collapses. In summa, there was none that walked idly. Each did what he was commanded, and what he could and could not do, and had he been noble, rich, or poor. So you can all think and reflect how that is in the colonies today. These images from the Große Geschichtsbuch, or the Chronicle, describe the Hutterite community as an ideal community. Nobody was idle, all worked together and served the common good. These images are repeatedly interpreted as description of the Hutterite community. The Hutterite community as clockwork or beehive. No one went idly. As aptly as these images describe a close, well-functioning and well-organized community, they are also always ideal images. An ideal image of what the ideal community should look like. Why this is so, I would like to show you by taking a look now at the church ordinances in the 16th century. The Hutterite community functioned and worked. That this was the case and that all functioned and worked together, a multitude of church ordinances ensured this working together. These ordinances were enormously important in giving structure and order to the Hutterite community. And one has to say the size of the Hutterite community in the 16th century required orders and rules. They regulated how each member of the congregation had to behave and what the various officers had to do. So there were orders or ordinances for very different areas. First of all, for the social and community life. For example, as you can see here, we have here a copy of an ordinance that was addressed to the office of the Haushalterin. And it's not so important now what's in that source and what's written down, but you can see when you look on the left side, on the bottom of the left side, that this ordinance has been revised. Something was deleted in other ordinances or added in this ordinance here. So these regulations and these ordinances were always adapted to changing conditions. In addition, there were ordinances that regulated which food everyone got each day, the so-called Kuchelordnung, and that's a copy of these Kuchelordnungen here. There we read, for example, that the sick were given richer food, and it was written down which food and drinking was available in times of distress. And secondly, there were ordinances for the various crafts. They dictated or they wrote down how a product should be made, what it should look like, what materials should be used. or which crafts should be involved in making a product. For example, we know that the Hutterites built carriages in the 16th century. The carriages that were also bought by noble people. And we know that in the manufacture of one carriage, for example, locksmiths, tailors, saddlers, blacksmiths, wainwrights, etc., all worked together, and all crafts were practiced at the Hutterite colonies in Moravia. These ordinances are a fantastic and very important source of information, giving us many insights into the living of the Hutterites in the 16th century. But the ordinances also tell us everything that did not work very well in the community. Because during the 16th century, there were many grievances that had to be dealt with. And this is also handed down by the ordinances. Especially when a matter is repeated again and again over years in the ordinances, then we can conclude that this grievance was permanent. Thus, the ordinances are a corrective to the very idealistic view in the Geschichtsbuch. And we see that sometimes the clockwork didn't run smoothly at all. The swarm of bees did not always fly around tirelessly, but some bees proved to be quite lazy. It can be said Hutterite life became more and more orderly in the course of the 16th century, but at the same time, there were massive problems in the practice of community life. And we will look at those a bit deeper now. The first grievance that is like ever repeating in Hutterite history is self-interest and infiltration of the community of goods and communal life. This has been a problem, as I said, for the Hutterites quite often in their history. There's a 16th century saying that I think most of you know, Gottes Wort ist nicht so schwer, wenn nur der Eigennutz nicht wär. Self-interest, the death for the community of goods. The ordinances hand down several examples. It is reported that craftsmen lined their own pocket and did not deliver earned money to the Haushalter. And sources tell of how these Hutterite artisans proceeded. They worked by adding a surgeons to the selling price. They kept the difference from the fixed price themselves. The rest of the money they delivered to the Haushalter. Other craftsmen worked in the evening or at night and sold the products on their own account. Another example that we know from the ordinances is that the Hutterites started having their private gardens. These private gardens came into vogue, and families began growing their vegetables and keeping their own small livestock, which is actually not really a problem in itself, but the problem was that people then no longer went to the große Stube for dinner, but ate at home. All these developments were the consequence of the good and prospering lifestyle the Hutterites cultivated from the second half of the 16th century on. And the good and abundant life that the Hutterites led did not necessarily have a positive effect on communal life. The desire for own possessions and a luxury style of living was awakened. The products the Hutterites made were often luxury products. That was the desire of the customers, and the Hutterites were fulfilling those desires. But gradually, the desire to have such luxury products also grew among the Hutterites themselves, such as precious ceramics or precious pottery or beautiful clothing. From the ordinances, we can read that the Hutterites were very nobly dressed in the late 16th century. They wore the best clothes and the most beautiful silk in bright colors. At regular intervals, the orders demand simplicity, plainness, and discreet dress. For example, they state that the garment should not be dyed anymore. And the pottery made for their own community should be painted in subtle colors and without too stylish ornate patterns. The Hutterites also, well, they became in the second half of the 16th century quite individualistic, which could not only be shown by growing own vegetables in the private gardens and not going to the große Stube to eat, but they also went their own ways. Members of the church, members of the community left the Bruderhöfe, the colonies, without permission to go to the nearby town, to the markets or to the inns. And then we have that very strange sentence in the ordinance from 1612, where it is said, if evildoers are judged, our people should not run to watch. So astonishingly, the Hutterites who had been persecuted decades before now ran to executions and watched the spectacle. These executions, they were spectacles in the 16th century, and the Hutterites joined. Communal life became definitely under stress and under pressure in the second half of the 16th century due to a lot of grievances in the communities. For the Hutterites in the late 16th century, luxury, self-interest, pocketing the money, and the importance of families undermined the idea of community of goods. So one finds a Hutterite church that is far from being mature, far from having mature Christians, far from people that think what communal life is in itself. Communal life needs responsibility from each individual. And definitely communal life needs rules that everyone obeys. What is important, however, that these rules that communal life order and make it function, these rules must be checked again and again to see whether they are still helpful for communal life or whether they make it too rigid, which was the case in the Hutterite church in the second part of the 16th century. So the question arises, why did these grievances occur within the Hutterite community? And I want to give you three answers to this question. First of all, the external conditions were responsible. Second, the growth of the Hutterite community. And third, the integration of the following generations. First, the general conditions, the integration and the tolerance in Moravia. As I said, from the middle of the 16th century onwards, the Hutterites in Moravia were no longer the persecuted ones. They no longer experienced persecution. They were tolerated and highly valued for their economic performance, the production of good and high quality handicraft products. They were essential for the economy of the estates, for the economy that the Moravian nobility put up on their estates. From the 1560s onwards, one speaks of the good and then of the golden years of the Hutterites. So no persecution, prosperity, wealth, and good reputation. But the good and golden years did not necessarily make good Hutterites. Essential elements of the Hutterite belief, as I have shown a little bit, the spiritual life and the commitment to the community of goods came under pressure. Business was more important than the spirit. Second, the growth of the community, the integration of new people. The Hutterites carried on, you have here a map, on the right side you see Moravia, and then you have all the past that the Hutterite missionaries used in the 16th century. The Hutterites carried out a very intensive missionary work in the 16th century, which continued throughout the entire 16th century. So it was regular that every spring the Hutterites sent out missionaries to various regions of the Holy Roman Empire. And you see it's mainly southern Germany where they sent out their missionaries. It's Württemberg, it's the Palatinate, it's Thuringia and Tyrol and Switzerland. These were the main centers where Hutterite missionaries went in the 16th century. These missionaries preached the Hutterite faith everywhere, even in other Anabaptist churches, which led to some frictions. So they steal the sheep in these other Anabaptist churches. The Hutterites were of the opinion that a Christian life according to the Hutterite order could only be lived in Moravia. And I mean, that's true because only there was tolerance and only there these large colonies could be established. Therefore, everyone who wanted to become a Hutterite in the 16th century had to migrate to Moravia. So still in the second half of the 16th century, many migrants came to Moravia who wanted to join the Hutterites. The problem with that the immigration to Moravia soon overtaxed, or they put the communities to some tasks, and they were confronted with a lot of tasks to integrate all these people that came to the colonies, all these people that had to be integrated into community of goods. The Hutterites set up a special confessional education program that every newcomer had to go through and where he or she learned about the Hutterite faith. But there was also another problem. Not only people who were interested in the Hutterite faith came, but also those who had economic problems in their old homeland. They hoped to find a good life, the paradise on earth, on the economically prosperous Hutterite colonies. So you would say in modern terms, these were economic refugees that came to the Hutterite colonies. But the problem was that people lived on the Hutterite colonies who enjoyed the good life, but had little interest in the faith of the Hutterites. Usually one has to say converts or new people who join a church are a good thing because they keep the church alive. They also challenge the old church members to answer the questions of the new ones. The newcomers question the old system because they need to get to know it and they want the answers. They want to know, why do you do the thing you do? And the old church members, they have to find answers to the questions of the newcomers. That means they have to engage themselves anew with their own faith and their life and find answers. All this keeps a church alive. This brings renewal, which is always necessary. But if the spiritual norms are not accepted by the new people, and if they not accept these spiritual norms that are fundamental or essential for the life of the church, and of a church as the Hutterite was one, then this will soon lead to great problems. The third point was that was the integration of the next generation of Hutterites, so the children that grew up in the church. Faith is not hereditary, as the saying goes. And I found in my documents a very interesting sentence from a Hutterite Leah on Colossae 2, 16-23. A Leah that might be from the 17th century. We don't know that very well. But it says, and I read that for you in German, because you know the Lehren in German. Und ob gleich so alt wäre wie Methuselah, hätte einen Bart bis auf die Erde und wäre in der Gemeinde Gottes geboren. Sein Vater wäre der allervornehmste und berühmteste gewesen. Er lebte aber wie die Welt, übertritt und verlässt das Gebot Jesu Christi, der ist nicht Christi Knecht, sondern der Welt und ihres Vaters. So faith and being a Hutterite is not hereditary. But how do you make sure that children who grow up in the Hutterite community do not become Hutterites just because they were born Hutterite? How do you make sure that they become Hutterites by conviction? Questions that the Hutterites also asked in the 16th century. And they came up especially in the mid-16th century, because in the golden and in the good and the golden age of the Hutterite church, children born into the community could no longer draw on the experience of persecution and confessional and political pressure, which had influenced the first generation and which had brought a very enduring faith and believers who were willing to suffer for their faith. The later generations were born into a community of prosperity. And furthermore, remember the map and the distance between Moravia and the rest of Germany. The Hutterites lived in an environment with a foreign language, with a Czech language. So it was not easy for the next generation or for children born into the church to leave the colonies again, because they were German and you had Czech in the area around the colonies. So the Hutterites were very far from the territory of their mother tongue. And it would have been a long distance travel to reach the area of the German mother tongue. So one can assume that the Hutterites around 1600 had quite a few people in their midst that lived in the colonies without an inner conviction. So the question is how to pass on to the next generation the fire of a faith lived out voluntarily and with conviction. The historian Robert Friedman, who did a lot of studies on the Hutterites, spoke of the fire of first love in the first generation of the Hutterites. This fire of first love should be passed on to the children. This fire was shaped by voluntariness and maturity, but how to pass it on? And furthermore, what is sometimes really passed on? The fire or merely the ashes of an already burnt out fire? Maybe only the tradition, an outward framework? How did the Hutterites react to the change? And how did they try to maybe focus the members again on the Hutterite idea, on the spiritual idea behind the Hutterite life, behind community of goods? First of all, they started writing the history. From the middle of the 16th century on, the Hutterites began to write down their church history in order to preserve the past and the early history of the community for future generations. Renewal through memory. In the preface of the Große Geschichtsbuch, the Hutterite chronicler Caspar Breitmichel wrote, and I quote it now, "In my opinion, this work, so the Große Geschichtsbuch, will be a valuable mirror in which many God-fearing people may examine themselves, so that they may guard against every division and error and everything that does not serve God's honor. Writing down history shall be a mirror for the present generation, renewal through memory." And the second thing the Hutterites did in the 16th century was that they wrote down, they wrote spiritual writings, spiritual books. Many Hutterites in the 16th century put down their thoughts on paper. Letters, confessions of faith, spiritual reflections emerged. This testifies to the vitality of the church in the 16th century. Reflecting on what is Hutterite was a general process in which many church members participated. So Hutterite was not a theoretical superstructure dictated by the elders, but was internalized by many church members because they themselves were also thinking about it and reflecting about it. The basic writing of the Hutterites, I already mentioned it, was Peter Riedemann's Rechenschaft, which was printed between 1543 and 1545. Also the Artikelbuch, written by Peter Walpott. It contained, among others, 3 important points which were repeatedly discussed: baptism, the Lord's Supper, and community. And sermons were written down. And besides this, all the letters of the missionaries who were active in the different regions of Germany. They repeatedly and constantly sent letters to the church in Moravia. And these letters that reached the colonies in Moravia, they were read aloud in the church. Afterwards, they were copied and recorded in large books, which you can still today find in the archives of Eastern Europe. And writings about community of goods emerged. And third, ordinances and traditions were established to regulate the life of the Hutterites. And this is the last point I want to reflect shortly now at the end of this presentation. The ordinances. The ordinances were, as we have seen, on the one hand, very important for the community as the Hutterites were with their community of goods, because they set the norms and standards for life to function at all. But ordinances also have their pitfalls. They can have a negative effect on the vitality of a community if they are only an external framework. If they become too important, they solidify and rigidify a community. They take away the inner spirit of a community because they only aim at external conformity. Exactly these developments can be discovered in Hutterite history until the beginning of the 17th century. Not only the ordinances do illustrate these developments, but also the idea of community of goods in itself. In the course of the 16th century, the adherence to community of goods became the center of the Hutterite faith. During one of my visits among you Hutterites some years ago, I don't know which visit it was, someone of you used the following picture, and I think that picture is very illustrative. This person said to me, the cart was placed in front of the horse. That means the cart, which symbolizes community of goods, was put into first place, in front of the horse, which is Jesus Christ. Actually, the horse, Jesus Christ, must always pull the cart, the community of goods. In the Hutterite faith, in the 16th and then also in the beginning of the 17th century, community of goods became an outward system. But community of goods is more than an outward system. It must be more than an outward system. It should never become that system of coercion that it became in the 16th century among the Hutterites. But the members of the church, they have to be mature Christians who internalize this system of community of goods. They have to be conscious of themselves that this community of goods costs something. As it is said, and I quote something from Luke 14, the verses 33 and the following, where Jesus said, so kann auch keiner von euch mein Jünger sein, der nicht allem entsagt, was hat. Das Salz ist gut. Wenn aber das Salz fade wird, womit soll es gewürzt werden? Es ist weder für das Erdreich noch für den Dünger tauglich, man wirft es hinaus. Wer Ohren hat zu hören, der höre. Sell everything. I'll take care of you, Jesus said to his disciples. The church takes care of you, say the Hutterites, but it costs something. So the question is, that is the topic of this lecture. It is only with good order that something can endure, ? Yes, I think, but the good order must never determine faith, but only support it. It should help to live the faith, but not be the faith in itself. If order determines the faith, it makes faith rigid. And orders and ordinances must be tested again and again, whether they are still good for a community, whether they are still suitable for current developments, conditions, and challenges of today or other times, whether they are merely coercive or voluntary. Then something can endure in a very good order, as the Hutterite history also shows, and what I hope that we have a look at it in the next lectures. So I say thank you without really getting the response. But I hope that you have a few questions maybe, or that we maybe can start a discussion. And I think I turn over to Jesse or Kenny again.
Yes, thank you, Astrid, for your stimulating lecture there. Just a reminder, those of you watching, there are two options to ask questions. You can do it via the chat option. You can even, I think, raise your hand in there. You can also do it through Menti. If you go to www.menti.com, MENTI.com. The code for this lecture series is 8166. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kenny. 8166. Those are two ways that you can ask questions. While I get people ask their question, let me ask you this, Astrid. You mentioned something about when the newcomers were brought to the community, the Hutterites set up a confessional process or a curriculum of sorts to help to integrate these newcomers into the community. Can you say more about what that process looked like? What do we know about that?
Yeah, we have good sources about what the people had to go through, and it was some kind of lecture or teachings, regular teachings. People had to attend, like school teachings, where they learned about the Hutterite faith and everything, and they were said that they should go to the Lehre and listen to the teachings. Afterwards, people could decide if they wanted to stay or not. I mean, I think this teaching was also some kind of lesson the Hutterites learned from the early years, when a lot of people joined and then returned again. So they tried maybe to be more try to make sure that the new people really got what the Hutterite faith is. So it was some kind of regular lessons those people attended.
Mm-hmm. What will be some of the main sources where we would see that process?
Where we see that in the ordinances, some ordinances address this lessons, and we also have it from reports from people that returned to their old homelands who didn't want to stay, and then when people returned to their old homelands, they were often asked by the authorities how life in Moravia was, and then they report something like that. Okay.
There's a question about the source of the missionary map that you showed. And while you respond to that as well, maybe can you talk about whether there's a pattern in how many missionaries were sent out from the first half of the 16th century to the mid 16th century to the end of the 16th century? Do we see a decline at some point, or does it stay fairly even, the interest in missions? So first of all, the source of the map, and then maybe that question.
The map is from a book that came out, I think, 2 years ago about Anabaptism in Württemberg. I can mail you the title, maybe then you can share the information. It was made for that book, and I wrote an article in that book about the mission work of the Hutterites in Württemberg in the 16th century. Yeah, the mission work, we don't have the exact numbers, how many every year were sent out. But we know that the Hutterites looked very seriously at the needs in the different regions of Germany at that time. So they saw maybe that sometimes they even got the notice before that somebody wrote, well, please send missionaries to Württemberg or to the Palatinate. And then the elders decided, okay, well, let's do that or not. So that was one thing, that there was a request for Hutterite missionary that he should come and preach the faith. And then that was also, well, a bit a grievance then in the late 16th century in Hutterite mission work, that they looked very closely where there were economic problems maybe in regions. I sometimes have the impression that some Hutterite missionaries try to count numbers, what we know from modern missionary work. So they try to go into regions where the fruit was very ripe, or where they thought they might
go for low-hanging fruit.
Yo, right. so that they could take more people to Moravia. Because we can see that, especially in Württemberg in the 16th century, that when the times get difficult and the economic crisis is high, or and economy is not so good in Württemberg, then the Hutterites sent out their missionaries and try to get the people out. That caused also the problems of the economic refugees, yeah, because then people tried to go to Moravia, or decided to go to Moravia because and left behind all the debts and all the rundown business and tried to start a new life in Moravia. And then they sometimes were disappointed that there was also a faith system and not only the paradise where, I don't know, everything was prepared and no one had to do anything. We know from some of the people that joined the Hutterites in the 16th century, when they came back to their old homeland, they were disappointed that they had to work in Moravia. So they had hoped to find the paradise without working. So actually it is difficult to say how many were sent out, but it was out of request, necessity, and sometimes these missionaries also had the task, or had to visit relatives of Hutterites that were in Moravia in the old homelands, and maybe deliver letters or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a question from Nina Schrader. She says, thanks so much for the talk.
Hi, Nina.
You spoke about the different crafts that the Hutterites excelled in: pottery, tailoring, wagon making. Did most colonies have all of these craft specializations, or did any one colony specialize in only one or two of these? What did the craft specialization look like?
Difficult to say, because we don't have an exact plan of the crafts in each colony. From the sources, I would say that many of the crafts were at the colonies, though some were a bit specialized. So I would imagine that if there is a carriage and a very luxury carriage, because one of these carriages went to the, or was ordered by the Markgraf von Brandenburg, then I would think maybe that that was a bit focused or concentrated on one colony. What we know, I mean, some crafts, or if you have the millers or Meierhöfe, that was not on each colony. And these mills were there were only a few mills in Moravia.
Next to a river, right? Because they had to be next to a river. The mills.
Pardon me?
So the mills had to be next to a river. That's why they couldn't be in any community, right?
No, it was also windmills. Not only the mills to the river. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But I mean, there were not so many. But I mean, and there might be smaller colonies that also had not all the crafts. But it's difficult to tell, because there is actually no source that tells us this colony has these crafts and these.
Yeah. There's a question from Decker community about the process of baptism, the preparation for baptism. Do we know what that process looked like in the 16th century?
It was also some lessons that had been done for baptism. And as far as I know, if I recall it rightly, then I think that also the people who wanted to baptize joined these lessons for the newcomers.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the sermons themselves? Question about whether these sermons would have been directed at the refugees and the newcomers, because they have this very strict, almost as if they are chastising the listener, feel to them. Some of the sermons do. Were they directed at refugees and newcomers, some of them in particular that we know? Or was it just the community was in general maybe dysfunctional, and so the sermon writers were just picking up a more polemical tone?
Well, I mean, I don't, well, okay. The sermons we know of today are very difficult to really say when they were written, because there is no date usually on the sermons. We can only guess from the content of the sermon that there might have been special sermons to those in these lessons for the newcomers. Yes, but I'm not aware of one, so I would guess but I would guess there were some. What I'm aware of is a sermon, and that is a very interesting sermon, a sermon addressed to the Hutterites to welcome the newcomers, because there was also a problem, obviously a problem, with the old Hutterites being on the colony, welcoming the newcomers, because that sermon says, well, when there are new people coming to our colonies, then welcome them and be careful and be slowly with them and try to integrate them. So that was actually a sermon addressed to the old Hutterites, admonishing them to welcome the newcomers. The other sermons is quite difficult. My assumption is that there actually are not that many sermons left from the 16th century. Most of the sermons we have are from the 17th, maybe from the 17th century. Sometimes you can guess from the content from which time it might be. Some sermons address the Turks or the robberies of the Turks. Then you can see they might be from the early 17th century, when many Hutterite colonies were attacked by the Turks during the Turkish War. So then you can say, well, they are maybe from the 17th century.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Moravia was a paradise for the Hutterites in the 16th century. There's a question here about what are some of the reasons for that prosperity and paradise status in Moravia. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the beginning, it was the general situation in Moravia, because the landlords or the noble people in Moravia, they were on the one hand, they were influenced by the Protestant Reformation. So there were some were Lutherans. And Moravia belonged to the Habsburg territory in the 16th century. It was Habsburg territory, but the nobility in Moravia was very strong, and they were very they could resist the Habsburgs very well. So it was some kind of intern rebellion sometime against the Habsburgs, and they liked to use the Hutterites as argument against the strong confessional pressure, the Catholic pressure that came from the Habsburgs. So that the nobility in Moravia had an interest in having the Hutterites, because they had an argument to keep out the Catholic faith and to protect the Hutterites. And then they realized very soon that the Hutterites were very good craftsmen, and that the economy the Hutterites brought to Moravia was a gain, or was good for the economy on the estates in Moravia. So that's why the conditions were so good in Moravia in that times. And there was no persecution, but there were two very short periods of persecution in Moravia in the 16th century, but then there was no persecution anymore. So, and the Hutterites prospered, and the nobility invited more Hutterites or more Anabaptists. So they knew nothing is pure Nächstenliebe, or nothing is only just to welcome people because we are so good. The nobility knew how to get money from these subjects.
Do the Hussite wars 100 years earlier, roughly, do those play into this at all in terms of, yeah, can you say a bit about that as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, it played in all this picture because many of the noble people that were Lutheran or Protestant in the 16th century were always the families were influenced already by the Hussiten in the 15th century. So the soil was prepared, if you want to say, yeah.
So they had already had a Reformation 100 years earlier, and they were ready for many of these new ideas. There was a tradition of reform already in Moravia, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that some communities, especially during times of persecution, grew from about 400 people to a couple of thousand, up to 3,000. There's a couple of questions about that. Do we know what are the sources for this? And do we know whether they adjusted their structures to accommodate, and how they adjusted their structures, their community structures, to accommodate that many people?
I don't know actually. There is not much information about that. Maybe one should have a look. I mean, there are. You could maybe have a look in the Kuchelordnungen. Maybe you find something there that maybe it had some impact on the food display, on the food and how food was on the food distribution, or which food was given to the people in the colonies. But actually, there is no. It's only rare. It's only some. I think the Chronicle reports it from time to time that some refugees from colonies that were given up were taken in by another colony, but there's no further information. Maybe one should have a look again in the ordinances, especially with a focus on this question. Maybe you find something, and the Kuchelordnung.
Another question about the map of the Hutterite mission movement from Andrew Claassen Brown. The map is interesting, but it does not show any of the mission work in Silesia. Could you say a little bit about Anabaptist and Hutterite communities from Silesia? Were there any in Silesia?
There was a short try, and again later in the 18th century there was another try to have a community in Silesia, but it was very shortly. It was only Ulrich Stadler who was there, and it was no special mission work. I mean, I think I don't have the map here now. I think it also doesn't show the one colony that was established in West Prussia. I mean, there was also in Elbing, there was the attempt to establish a Hutterite colony there. And that is also not on the map, because the map actually was for an article on the Hutterite mission work in Württemberg. There was also Hutterite mission work in Hesse and a bit more north. That's also not here on the map.
Do we know why they did not?
So whoever is good in your colonies to draw maps, please, we would definitely need more maps for Hutterite history.
So it sounds like they didn't really go to Silesia very much. Do we know why they stayed away from that area? That's where Peter Riedemann is from, right?
Yep. No, I can't say that. Why they stayed away? I mean, the Silesia was Habsburg too. I mean, in the 16th century. Where Hutterites or where Anabaptists were depended a lot on the local or regional conditions. So, I mean, Moravia was really the paradise, because nowhere else could Anabaptist life be lived so good as in Moravia. I mean, actually also in other parts of Germany, persecution was not that harsh anymore, especially in the second half of the 16th century. But you were nowhere else you were able to establish these large colonies with these many people as in Moravia. And I would assume that it was also not possible in Silesia, and it was not possible in West Prussia, because they also gave up that experiment again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a comment here from Crystal Spring. In the Chronicle, there is an admonition that communities, quote, communities not compete with each other, end quote. This would imply, would it not, that they were producing similar goods. So can you speak to that situation, and maybe even the broader situation of the temptation and the problem of competition between communities?
Yeah, well, first of all, I write down the Silesia question because maybe I can look that up again and say something about that next weekend. Well, the competition of the Hutterite communities, there was competition. Yes, I mean it's a bit this business is all, and it was also how can I say, it was always the question, when one colony had problems, should the others help or not? So the Hutterite community in whole was not that peaceful as it might seem in the 16th century.
Not as harmonious, huh?
Huh?
So not as harmonious as the ideal would make it out to be.
You're right.
So each community have basically financial autonomy. There was no centralized bank.
You're right. Mm-hmm. And was also quite autonomous regarding food and what was in agriculture regard.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was a lot of to earn the money, and the ordinances are full of that what didn't work in working together in the 16th century.
Mm-hmm. So our time is almost up. I think maybe one more question before we wrap it up for today. There's a question about the role of the Haushalterin. What kind of work did she do? Why was she called the mother of the sisters? What do we know about the Haushalterin?
Well, we know that she was head of the Spinnstuben, so actually was in charge of making clothes and everything, and she was the overseer of all the female officers in the communities. Like there were several other female officers. Maybe the veteran. I think I had her on the slide. She was in charge for the beds of the ill people and of the children in the school. There were special women officers that were in charge for bringing food to the ill people, cooking and everything. So she was actually the overseer of the female part of Hutterite society, and that she was called mother of all the sisters. I mean there's no definition or no specification about that, but it seems to me that it is said, well, she was some kind of the women could go to her and ask and could find help and everything. So she was some kind the good heart maybe of the female part of the Hutterite society.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for this, Astrid. This has been very interesting, and especially grateful that we can do it another 3 times in the next couple of weeks. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kenny. He may have some last-minute details to remind us about in terms of registration for the next week's lectures in order to wrap this up.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Astrid. It really has been wonderful to hear this survey of this very brief segment of Hutterite history. I'm sitting here listening with somebody else, and there was this one time where we looked at each other and I just said, this is deja vu all over again. So this is a good time for us to reflect on this, and that is the purpose of the discipline of history, and I think what we as Christians are called to do. I also want to thank all the attendees for showing up. It's an unusual thing to have a lecture series in this way, but you've been here, and thank you for showing up. I've been looking at the numbers for devices who have logged in, and we peaked at 99. I never saw the number 100, but I know that there are community groups gathered to watch this as a community, so we must have had well over 100 listeners. That is something I am deeply, deeply grateful for. I also want to do a bit of what we call in Hutterisch Sottelklupfen. We are organizing this lecture series free to anybody who wishes to watch, but there is cost involved in organizing it. And I know many of you have already sent in donations, and we are very, very grateful for that. And in the next 3 weeks, if you wish to do so, that will also be accepted with gratitude. On the website, we've had some technical difficulties. After today, I'm going to remove all the registration information and start from scratch, okay? The web link that you used to join in today will still work if you want to join that way. But in case things go awry, if we have to change something, it would be good if on Monday you revisited jdmlectures.org and registered again. Okay, that will mean you'll be signed up to get all the information in a good, timely, and ongoing manner. We also encourage you to talk about this series with your friends, your family, and community members. That's the best way to spread the word about this. And this is such wonderful content that I think the more Hutterites hear it, the better. So please do some mission work, pardon the pun, for us for this series. So again, thank you, Astrid. Thank you, Jesse, for helping with organizing this. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Go in peace, and God bless you.